Okay, so we all know that Trump has been extremely vocal about, voter fraud, election fraud, the election being stolen from him. He said that he won all these states just because he had a lead in them, and then he's complaining
Yes,
because,
about the mail-in
yes, they're
ballots and
one-sided only or
yeah.
something like that. He's so mad about it. Um, yeah, so I wanted to take a look at basically what other U.S. presidential transitions across history may have also been a little testy, because it couldn't possibly just be Trump who's a poor loser.
Yes, there has to be others. So, what did
Yes,
you learn?
well, I learned a lot of interesting things actually. I took a fun deep dive into history, like a lot of things I didn't know before. But I guess before I jump into that, I just kind of want to say that, yeah, Trump's been a problem. He went in um, when he came in after Obama, saying that he wasn't born here, and trying to delegitimize him. And then Obama was slapping back with the basically just that you're unfit for the presidency.
Yes, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And then Biden had a good quote recently as well, because Trump's trying to retain power. So Biden said, I just think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly. How can I say this tactfully? I think it will not help the president's legacy.
Wow,
It was a pretty good line.
that's very yeah. Yeah, that is a good one.
um, yeah, and like despite the fact that maybe it's good entertainment for me or you, it's important to have a smooth presidential transition.
Yeah, I think it would only make sense to have a smooth transition so that especially when you're changing parties, right? So that
Totally. Well, the
everything.
danger right now is specifically with COVID because Biden is supposed to be able to sit in on the daily presidential briefings just to get up to speed before he takes office. But Trump's been blocking him, denying him, and if there is any chance of a vaccine rollout this year, then that could seriously be delayed or just not implemented in the as fastest way
Yeah,
possible.
that seems really
Yeah.
bad. So Biden's not going to know what's going on until basically he gets the job in January, which that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And if you go back to George Bush and Al Gore, the 9/11 Commission actually said that if there had been a longer transition and more cooperation, that there might have been a better response to the 9/11 attack, or it might have even been prevented. Because supposedly,
Wow.
yeah, from what I read, when they were fighting over the voting count in Florida, um, that was time that George Bush could have been assembling a national security team, but wasn't.
Wow, that is
Hmm.
very interesting. So huge
Yes.
consequences potentially to not having smooth transitions.
Absolutely. And Bill Clinton had a lot of fingers pointed at him for holding back the transition during that recount and kind of delaying the Supreme Court decision regarding that. And if you're wondering, the Supreme Court, they ruled 5-4 that no constitutionally valid recount could be completed by their December 12th safe harbor deadline, like their safe cutoff.
Oh, that's interesting. So they didn't have any of this settled until the 12th
Yeah,
of
exactly.
December.
Like it was argued in
So
the
a
11th
whole,
of December,
yeah.
and yeah, they didn't know for quite a while. And that one it was 5-4. So it was kind of Scalia and the conservatives voted against the recount because their argument was that there just wasn't yeah, like in Florida they had so many different kind of rules and regulations, like it was not streamlined. So every county kind of had a different idea of what should count as a legal vote and what shouldn't. Like I mean, in some counties, crumpled corners would be a ballot you cast aside, and other ones that had like maybe an ink splotch or something would be counted, but not a crumpled paper. So
Wow,
the
that's so
Supreme
weird.
Court was
You'd
like,
think
it's
it would be a
too,
little bit
yeah.
more streamlined even
Mhm.
just
For
by
per
by
state,
state,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. There was a lot of different rules, and then kind of the uh, Ruth Bader Ginsburg side of the equation was more like, well, every vote should count. You can't say that it's not constitutional to count legally
Votes,
casted
yeah.
votes. But anyway, they lost at the end of the day, and it came down to 537 votes in Florida, but they didn't recount. Bush just won.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's like the most recent concrete example of what was a really uneasy transition. All right, so now if we jump back in time, we go way back into the 1800s, the very, very beginning of it, actually. So when George Washington decided to leave the presidency, John Adams was the first guy in after him.
Right.
But
Yes.
then the first election, the first battle, was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson after Adams had been in for like a few controversial years. Like people didn't think maybe he did the best job.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so Thomas Jefferson came in, and those guys, they were both founding fathers. They were both good friends, but they found themselves on the opposite side of the Federalist Republican divide. And yeah, if anyone has seen Hamilton, they might have a bit of context here, but basically, um, Thomas Jefferson was all for states' rule, and he wanted states to have more power, whereas the Federalists, they wanted a strong central government.
Yes, which is more in line with what
Hmm.
Washington wanted as well at the
Exactly.
beginning.
So John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were both Federalists. Washington wanted a strong central government. But interestingly to note, I read that John Adams was actually really snobbish and rude to George Washington. And
Wow,
yeah, at the beginning,
that's
he said he
crazy.
wasn't fit for presidency as well because he was like a gruff farm boy and uneducated, basically.
Wow, very interesting. So
Yeah.
he did not respect Washington.
But everyone else does. So what does that say about John Adams? Okay, yeah, so basically, there was an election in 1800. It was extremely testy. It led to a big falling out. The supporters on both sides were, hurling their worst insults at each other. So Jefferson's supporters described John Adams as hideous and hermaphroditical.
Oh my gosh.
And those who backed Adams referred to Jefferson as mean spirited and low lived. And basically, things were bad between them. And again, they were close friends, but Adams did not even show up for Inauguration Day when Jefferson won.
Oh wow.
Hmm. But I read that Adams actually left Jefferson a nice note in the White House saying that he had left him seven horses, and 2 carriages for his use.
That's so nice.
Yeah.
7 horses.
He left him a nice note, but he did this very controversial thing called the Midnight Appointments, where in his last few weeks in office, he put forward all these new judges that were meant to reinforce Federalist ideals.
Wow.
Yes, and when Jefferson came in, it basically led to a landmark Supreme Court case because he had to, fight for his state's rule.
Wow, that's very interesting. So he just secretly added in a bunch of new judges.
Yeah, that almost sounds familiar.
Yeah. It's amazing how
Yeah,
much
history
judges
repeats
have
itself,
to
I
do
guess,
with
hey?
this. Yeah.
Yeah, so those two guys, they did not speak to themselves or to each other after the campaign, like for 12 years. They
Wow.
didn't talk to each other until 1812. But once they started talking again, they were fast friends. They kept up an amazing correspondence for the rest of their lives until they both died hours apart on the same 4th of July in
Wow, that's so interesting.
1826. Yeah, the same day they died.
That is so interesting.
And then they kind of reconciled just because John Adams was kind of saying this thing basically that was like he wanted a government of laws and not a government of men, and Thomas Jefferson agreed. Okay, so if we fast forward past John Adams and Jefferson, we have John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So this is a different guy.
John
Yeah,
Adams.
John Quincy.
Okay.
So this is in 1828, and they're actually having a rematch because John Quincy Adams won the first campaign, and then 4 years later they duked it out again.
Interesting.
Now, Jackson's supporters were extremely upset because they thought they lost the first election due to what they're labeling as a corrupt bargain. Basically, they said that John Quincy Adams and this guy Henry Clay cut an inside deal where John Quincy Adams would be president and then Clay would take over after him.
Do you think that they did cut that deal?
That's entirely possible. I don't know that it didn't happen. I don't know much about that, but basically the Jacksonians, their resentment only grew across the 4 years that they were in office, and so it fueled a really mean, dirty campaign for 1828. Even by today's standards, it was pretty rough.
Bad.
Yeah, I think this is one of the worst ones I read about for sure. So Jackson's marriage came under intense scrutiny, as did his ownership of slaves. They called Jackson a closet Caesar.
Wow.
And what really happened that was quite terrible was Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel Jackson, who was already really hated politics, already was not interested in this. Basically, they went after her in the public.
That's brutal.
They took her down. They called her a slut, a bigamist, and she was basically publicly tormented until she died.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
That's
even before
horrible.
the election campaign was over.
Oh my gosh.
They blame
That
her
is
death
so
on the
sad.
yeah,
On just the
stress
pressure
and
or the
people hating her so
wow.
much.
That's all horrendous.
So she died. Now, Jackson ended up winning easily. Anyway,
Wow,
so
interesting.
yeah, he got in. He got a lot of the votes, a good strong majority. But basically, that's not where the shenanigans ended. So, once he won, his supporters surged into Washington to try to prevent any 11th hour hijinks that maybe John Quincy Adams had
yes.
planned.
Any more
Yes.
appointment of judges or anything like that?
But they literally busted through the White House windows. Like, they broke in, soiled the carpets, upturned the furniture, broke the china, like ripped the
Oh
curtains off
my
the wall.
gosh, that is crazy.
Yeah, they completely destroyed it. They were like a horde of barbarians. And John Quincy Adams had to escape out the back. Andrew Jackson had to also flee so he wasn't crushed by his own supporters.
Oh my gosh, some
It
people
was
are.
pretty intense. And then afterwards, Andrew Jackson, he basically fired everyone that worked there. And there was a lot of White House staffers that were like, not really political roles, like
Yes,
yeah,
it was just their job.
postmasters and
Yeah,
customs
yeah,
collectors.
yeah.
But at that time, they basically had been holding their jobs for decades and were thinking that like it was their property. They were going to bequeath this job to their son.
Yeah, it
Um,
was their job. That
but
was
Jackson was like, no, we need regular rotation in office for democracy to work. And honestly, Jacksonian politics changed like U.S. politics forever because of this.
wow.
hmm
That
And
is a crazy.
Andrew Jackson became a two-term president, which, as you know, there really isn't that many of.
No,
hmm
not the norm.
Okay, so let's keep going here. So Abraham Lincoln, he also had a very, very difficult transition period. Now, the guy in before him, James Buchanan, he was kind of seen as sort of like a lame duck, kind of docile and not really useful, really.
Okay.
The civil slavery crisis had grown across his 4 years as president, and he did nothing to do anything about it. In fact, he actually sided with the South kind of every time there was an argument. So
Okay.
James Buchanan is not a great dude. He was actually 65 when he was elected, and that made him the second oldest president at the time.
Wow.
hmm
65 nowadays is not a very old president.
No, it's yeah, they're older now. So yeah, that Buchanan's kind of docility, let's call it, also saw his Democratic Party splintered into factions, and Buchanan was kind of stood on the sidelines. He was ousted a little bit, but that created a bit of a power vacuum where Abraham Lincoln and the new Republican Party seized kind of that space and
Yeah.
became like a huge force in American politics. Now, lots went down between Lincoln's election and his inauguration. 7 southern states seceded from the United States and formed a new government, the Confederate States of America.
Wow.
And then 8 further slave states debated whether they would join the Confederacy during this time.
So did this all happen between November and January is what you're
Well,
saying?
back then, Lincoln was actually going to take office in March. Like, March was when
Okay.
you.
The elections were just a
Yes.
little, yeah,
So
different
this
time
took
of the
place
year.
between then and March. Now, Lincoln went on this epic train ride across America, like to get to the White House. Like, it was intense. He had an assassination attempt against him that he
Oh
heard
my
about and then
gosh.
foiled by taking a different train at a different time across overnight. That was in Baltimore. But all along the way, he was giving these incredible speeches to like 50,000, 100,000 people. And he was just building up to the Gettysburg Address. Like, he was, practicing and
Oh,
toying with those
yeah.
ideas. And sometimes he was kind of, I guess, being more understanding of the southern side of the equation in his speeches, and other times he was like, just like, we are going to end slavery. So he wasn't like 100% against slavery in all the speeches, but he was, I guess, trying to unite all the people,
Yeah.
and eventually this led to him giving the Gettysburg Address.
Wow. Very cool.
Yeah, and again, he was almost killed, so that was for sure a difficult transition
Yeah,
period.
that's
All right,
that's
now let's
crazy.
fast forward to Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And just so you know, this was also the last time that March was the month when you would take office.
Okay.
It became January after this. Now, Herbert Hoover was leaving office just as the entire United States economy had completely collapsed in the Great Depression.
Right.
So he was a reviled figure leaving because they wanted to hate him because of the economy.
Yeah.
And
They had to blame someone.
you're right, and it might have been his fault. I haven't read to him. I don't know. I don't know what his policies were at the time. But what I do know is that he had a very humiliating exit. Once FDR became the president-elect, they did not get along, and Hoover kept trying to control FDR and like get him to say certain things. He wrote him a letter and said like, "Hey man, tell the American people that the horrible economy situation is not my fault. Tell the American people that it's actually their fault because they're afraid of what you might do when you come into office."
Doesn't make any
It
sense.
was like it's like the markets are nervous about FDR, so that's why they crashed. So he tried to get out of
That's
that.
actually your fault,
Yeah,
not my
it was
fault.
unbelievable. And Roosevelt called him a fat, timid cape on.
Oh boy.
And Hoover called him a chameleon in plaid. Now,
In plaid.
yes,
I like that.
I guess he wore a lot of plaid back then. But anyway, Hoover told his friends, "I will never be photographed with him." But,
Did he follow through?
yes, on the inauguration day, they were photographed together. They exchanged a few words. That was March 4th,
That's funny.
1933.
I will never be
Yes,
photographed.
and
with
then
him.
another thing that happened actually was Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt. The first, the first to occur in a presidential transition, actually. So he was vacationing, and the bullets missed Roosevelt, but they mortally wounded the mayor, and they killed just a random woman in the crowd. So
Oh my gosh.
he
that's
survived,
horrible.
but other people were horribly injured.
Wow.
And later, JFK was targeted as well during like the transition period, but that was thwarted by law enforcement. And that was in December 1960, that one. So it has since happened since FDR. Okay, moving on, we've got Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Okay.
Now, those are obviously two towering names from the World War II era.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might remember some of their epic speeches to, I guess, bring up the morale of the United States.
Yes. Yeah.
And they were friends, they were allies, they worked together in the last days of World War II, and they, oversaw the victory. But they had a falling out regarding Eisenhower's silence on Senator Joe McCarthy. And Joe McCarthy was just kind of like a real wingnut back then. He was known for like telling everyone that Soviet and communist spies and sympathizers had infiltrated the United States, and they
Oh
were
yes, I remember
they
this.
were
And
in
they're
government,
like
they were
everywhere.
in university,
Yes.
they were
yeah.
in the film industry, so they were everywhere, right?
They were secretly managing like all things.
So that's when the term McCarthyism kind of came into play, and it was applied to anti-communist activities or rhetoric. But now the term is more broadly meant to mean demagogic, reckless, unsubstantiated accusations, as well as public attacks on character or opponents. Now, Truman said about about Eisenhower's silence, he said, "He has betrayed almost everything I thought he stood for."
Wow.
So pretty harsh words. And then Truman also wrote in his diary that Eisenhower and his advisors were afraid of some kind of trick during the transition period, but then he just wrote, "There are no tricks." So probably there wasn't, but we don't know for sure.
That's funny.
Now, moving on to the kind of the Vietnam scandal. So we have Lyndon B. Johnson transitioning to Nixon. So Lyndon B. Johnson had decided not to run for a second term of his own. He was the VP who took over after JFK was assassinated.
Okay, so he was like, I didn't even sign up for this job.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So what's really key here is that Lyndon B. Johnson kind of been flip-flopping on whether Vietnam should even be like a place that America was in. He had like up until this moment been, expanding the war, sending more troops, but he had been starting to question whether more troops was the right call. He knew that it was seriously a quagmire at this point. And then he was planning on doing some peace talks with Saigon. But what happened was Nixon destroyed Johnson's last chance of reaching a peace settlement. And this is in the last few weeks of his presidency. He secretly persuaded the Saigon government not to participate in talks with Lyndon B. Johnson.
That is awful. Why would Nixon do that?
I don't know, but LBJ said Nixon has blood on his hands.
Wow.
Yeah, and they still cooperated, like beyond that, in terms of the smooth transition, because
But still, that's a huge intervention before it's...
Yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson decided despite that to cooperate because he thought that the threat from the Soviet Union made a smooth transition like absolutely critical. But like, I don't know, Nixon could have done that because he wanted to stay in the war or because he wanted to be the one to, I don't know, make peace. But from what we saw in that Ken Burns Vietnam documentary we were watching was just basically that, like, every president was afraid to be the one to fail, and they kept expanding it and putting it off.
Yeah, because they
like,
didn't want to be the one that
the
called
next
it
guy will
off.
deal.
Yeah.
But Nixon made sure that LBJ wasn't the last guy to deal.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Crazy.
Yeah, and then if you just actually talk about Nixon a little bit, so obviously with the Watergate scandal, he was getting impeached, and he decided to resign, and his VP had to step in with only 25 hours of ahead notice, basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that like the shortest time? Or the
It's
shortest
the shortest time that
transition?
didn't involve the death of a president, which is, I guess,
Okay.
immediate.
Yeah.
So basically, Nixon, he decided to resign at 11 a.m. on August 8th, and then a few hours later, he told the nation. So, Ford,
Total
Gerald
25
Ford only
hours.
had 25 hours, yeah.
That's crazy. Do you think he knew? Well, I guess there's a possibility he knew it was coming, though. It might have been technically 25 hours, but
Yeah, he must have had some idea because, like, I
because, like,
mean, if you're getting
obviously the
impeached,
scandal was
yeah.
going on for a long time. So,
No president had resigned before, though, so
yeah,
it wasn't
it was
really
like,
like, this will for sure happen. All right, okay, now we're getting back up to George Bush Sr., George H.W. I didn't actually know much about this guy, but he's super interesting. Two-term vice president, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to China, National Party chairman, CIA director. The list goes on.
wow, that was way more than I thought you were going to say on his resume.
Yes, and now he was supposed to have a friendly takeover from Ronald Reagan, who he came in after, but it ended up being surprisingly rocky, mostly due to his cabinet nominees and things like that. So Bush retained numerous Reagan appointees, 27 of 53 White House staffers, but he fired everyone else. And then the real problem here was that there was like some of his nominees got rejected, and then they weren't sure who to pick for this, and there was kind of party infighting, or whether it should be this guy or that guy for this role or that role. And so in the media, it was like, wow, this administration has no idea what it's doing. They seem like they're
Oh my
astray before they've even got into power. So basically, that was where it was rocky. But then when you have Bill Clinton taking over from George H.W., it's like
Yeah.
downright chaotic, like turn everything up to the max. Now, this is before our time, so I hadn't heard of this before. Maybe you had, but the Nanny Gate scandal.
No.
Bill Clinton's nominee for the Attorney General, he was going to be the first one to put a woman in the role, and he went off the advice of his wife Hillary Clinton as to who to nominate.
Nominate.
And she had like really long, like overly long, extensive interviews with them and stuff. Anyway, so he nominated Zoe Baird, but Zoe Baird was rejected because it came out quite publicly that her and her husband had hired illegal immigrants to be the nanny for their children, and like were dodging taxes in some
Oh
way. And
gosh.
yeah, it was brutal. So she was rejected. And then the next girl they nominated, Kimba Wood, same thing. Also a
What?
Nanny Gate scandal.
Okay, you
Yes.
think he would have checked into that one
No.
thing
It's
afterwards?
it
Be
is
like, okay, let's just
unbelievable. We
let's
should watch a whole documentary on this because it was like, are you serious?
let's just make sure that the one thing this woman doesn't have
Look,
is an illegal nanny.
I'm all for women being in high political roles. I agree with that. I think that should be the case, but they just, I guess, chose the wrong girl for, the court of public appeal,
Yeah.
which I guess maybe even just happened with Hillary Clinton running.
Yeah.
Now, okay, let's fast forward and let's end on Bill Clinton back to another Bush, George
Yes.
W. Bush. So
Okay.
this is also super funny. So basically, like we heard earlier, Bill Clinton was slowing the transition period. He kind of favored Al Gore, and he was against Bush in some way. So he was like really not helping with the transition or the
Yeah.
voter
Well,
controversy.
which you can't really blame him
No,
because
you
there
can't.
was, I mean, it was unknown who won, so you can't, he's not going to go claiming that Bush won when
Well, and
that was
also
not true for those 30 days.
the circumstances of him leaving, I guess he wasn't like, I'm gonna make sure that I make all the right decisions.
Yes.
And, like, he was like,
Yeah. Sure, he
he
was a little
wasn't.
salty
Yeah, he was
at the
salty. He
end.
wasn't leaving like in such a way that it was like, I'm gonna make sure the Supreme Court has never worked so efficiently.
Yeah, no. That was not on his to-do
Okay,
list.
so George W. Bush is known for being like exceptionally punctual, like OCD punctual. So what President Clinton did was he invited George W. Bush for coffee before the Inauguration Day ceremony, and he kept the president-elect waiting. Like, I don't know how long it was. Reports vary, but it could have been like 25 minutes or something. He's just waiting outside the door
Aw.
to the Oval Office. But then get this. Here's the real kicker. So Bush gets in, and Clinton also invited Al Gore.
Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness, I would
Super
love
awkward.
to be at that table. That would be hilarious.
Yeah, it's so funny. Actually, it's
Oh
unbelievable.
boy, that's
Yeah, it's
funny.
unbelievable. And then, Bush during his campaign was also like, I'm gonna restore honor and integrity to the Oval Office. And that was obviously a swipe at Bill Clinton and his, let's call them
Yeah.
sexual misadventures.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it went Bush, Clinton, Bush, and then the George W. Bush was like, we're going back to the good old days.
It's always weird to me that the father and son were actually so close.
It's bizarre.
Like, it's so strange. Also, because when you think about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, husband and wife, they were many years apart from
Totally.
like when she
Totally.
ran, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, you would just think the father and son would be further apart, but they weren't. They were.
Yeah, husband and wife could be so apart, but that
Yeah,
father and
yeah.
son,
It's
no.
so
Well, just
strange.
imagine if they were back to back like that. How's that any different from the, you know, postmaster general giving his job to his son when he
Yes, no,
retires?
that's
It's
kind of
not
what it feels
Jacksonian,
like.
is it? It makes
Like
you
I know
think like,
people voted,
oh,
but still,
what is this? Divine,
that's a lot
divine
of bushes in that
leadership?
one time.
It certainly is. And I guess all we know now is that Jeb didn't get the presidency, so probably the Bush thing's done.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, yeah, those are the other choppy presidential transitions across time. It seems clear that America has a lengthy history with maybe poor losers, or I don't know, just
Yeah, and it
sour
definitely
grapes.
seemed to get like exponential through the years. Like now it's way more elections
Yeah, and when we have
than
the kind
not.
of extreme polarization that there is now, I guess it's just like everyone wants to say their barb.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank
Signing
you.
off.
Yep.
Thanks everyone for listening. See you next time.